everyone. Welcome to our presentation, Cicada Invasion with Dr. K from the Mount St. Joseph University. Just a quick housekeeping note, we are recording this to post on our YouTube channel. So we have disabled cameras just out of respect for your privacy, since this is going to be posted on YouTube. If you have questions for Dr. K, put them in the chat. Myself and Lisa Soper, we're both employees of the library, will be monitoring that and pass that on to Dr. K. And also we encourage you to check out a lot of our we've got a lot of fun cicada related information on our website. So just go to cincinnatilibrary.org and check out what we've got going on. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kritsky. Like I said before, he's from the Mount St. Joseph University, where he is the Dean of Behavioral and Natural Sciences. Among many other topics, Dr. K has studied and published several works on Egyptology, Charles Darwin, and insect evolution, including his most recent book, Periodical Cicadas, the Brood 10 edition, which is all about our local periodical cicada population, which is starting to show up now. So Dr. K, thanks for joining us today, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Hello, everybody. I'm going to take a second here to start my screen share. And I assume everyone can see this, my opening slide here. It's a pleasure to be here. I was telling Jennifer and Lisa that a lot of this work that I was working on started by spending several afternoons in the public library downtown, going through old newspaper records and so on. So it's a great resource we have in Greater Cincinnati, and I feel very honored that they asked me to participate. My goal today is pretty simple. I'm going to make all of you cicada experts, tell you what to expect, what's going on with cicadas, and then hopefully we'll have some time for some questions and answers. And I'm going to move quite along. I can't see your faces, so I'm not sure if you're getting it, but I will assure you, I know I'm a college professor. You know it's going to be 50 minutes, but I guarantee there's no quiz or test afterwards. So you can relax, and I'm not going to call in questions and what have you. So let's start. Brood 10 of the periodical cicadas. They're back. And what are cicadas? Let's deal with this. And a lot of people ask me this question. Well, don't we have cicadas every year? And we do. But we got to get into the nuance of this. Cicadas belong to the insect order Hemiptera, which are insects that have piercing, sucking mouthparts, and they include such things as the stink bugs. Many may have seen the brown marmorated stink bugs. They also include things like bed bugs that we see here, but they also include things like aphids and leafhoppers and so on. There is a family, Cicadidae, which is the family of cicadas. And it's part of a family that includes a superfamily of the Cicadioidea, which includes the Cicadidae and another group called the hairy cicadas. And they look a little similar to our cicadas, except they're very pubescent. They're covered with small, fine hairs. And they're the more generalized form. Within Ohio, we have 20 species of periodical cicadas. And that includes 6 species of, I'm sorry, it's not 20 species of cicadas, 6 species of periodical cicadas, and then 12 species of annual cicadas. And you might say, wait, that doesn't add up to 20. Well, it turns out 2 of those 12 species have a subspecies each. So there are 14 annual cicada species and subspecies, and 6 periodical cicadas. This slide that you see is not to scale. The periodical cicadas, which you see here on the far right, are not as large or larger than the annual cicadas. The annual cicadas, they come out every year. That's what they're called, annual cicadas, obviously. And they are mostly green, brown, black, almost like camouflage colored. And they have green eyes or black eyes. They have a very straight margin to the head between the eyes. And they're much bigger and broader in body than you'll find with the periodical cicadas. The annual cicadas will emerge in July, starting in early July, and they'll be around until into October. And these are the ones that you hear in the late summer going bzz, 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 the trees. They don't come out in big numbers. You're not going to be overwhelmed with large numbers of annual cicadas. In fact, if you walk up to a tree where you hear one singing, you look up at a tree, and it's hard to find them because they're backlit and they're camel colored. So it's very difficult to spot these guys. But their whole survival strategy is tied into their being cryptically colored and hidden in the trees. So birds will have a more difficult time finding them as well. So they'll come out in July, as I mentioned, and be gone by October. The periodical cicadas, on the other hand, They're coming out, they come out in May, and they're usually done by the end of June. They have, as you can see here on the slide, red eyes, orange veined wings, and bodies, when you look at them on the top, that are entirely black. Unlike the annual cicadas, these guys come out in enormous quantities. There's going to be no doubt when they come out. You will not have to look hard to find a periodical cicada. In many cases, one will probably land on you if you're not careful. They're rather clumsy flyers. They emerge, as I said, in great numbers, and that's to overwhelm their predators. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But they're not cryptically colored. Birds find them readily, and all sorts of things consume them. And after that all these things have been eaten, these cicadas have been eaten, there's still millions left. So now you know the difference between the two. The annual cicadas come out in July or through October. They come out every year like that. This year we have periodical cicadas. They'll be coming out in May and be gone by the end of June. The periodical cicadas that are coming out this year, we have 7 species in the United States of periodical cicadas. There are 2 life cycles, 17-year cicadas and 13-year cicadas. You're seeing here there are 3 species of 13-year cicadas. And we look at them from the top, there's 1 large one and 2 small ones. And that's one way of dividing. The larger one belongs to a species, Magicicada septendecim, but you can't tell what the species are by just looking at the top. You got them turn them over, and you'll see Magicicada septendecim has these larger, broad orange bands on the abdomen. Cassini is all black. Septendecula has very, very narrow bands. This, by the way, here, this is the female. The female's abdomen is more pointed than the male's. And sometimes you might get a very small septendecim or maybe a slightly larger decula, and you're not sure which species that belongs to. There's one other trick you can use. Magicicada septendecim has this orange band between the eye and the base of the wing. So now you can separate the 3 species of 17-year cicadas. There are 4 species of 13-year cicadas, 3 of which do occur in Ohio. There are 2 large species and 2 small species. And if you turn them over again, look at the underside, you'll see Neotrodecim, which Neotrodecim looks exactly like septendecim, and that's because the Neotrodecim evolved from septendecim. Looking at DNA studies, they're nearly identical. They probably evolved in just the last maybe 15, 20,000 years. So Tridecula has these much broader orange bands. So those are the 2 large forms. And then we have a Triticasini and Tridecula. They have the counterparts that we saw with the 17-year forms. These 4 species all have different calls. The 2 larger ones, their call is relatively similar, but at different pitches, and the calls of the other 2 are quite different indeed. Now, so we've got coming up this year 3 species coming out simultaneously for brood 10. What's a brood? Broods are year classes. Prior to the 1890s, there was a lot of confusion about periodical cicadas. Take Cincinnati, for example. We got, at that time, they knew we had at least 2 broods of cicadas, brood 10 and 14. So they would have a big brood 10. And then all of a sudden, 4 years later, we had more cicadas. And then 13 years later, we had cicadas. And then 4 years again, and so on. For areas where there's more than 2 broods, they became very confusing indeed. So a man by the name of Charles Marlett said, okay, let's summarize this. We're just going to say for convention, every 17-year cicada that emerges in 1893, that belongs to brood 1. All the cicadas coming out in 1894, they belong to brood 2. That's for the 17-year cicadas. And numbers 1 through 17 are reserved for 17-year cicada broods. The 13-year cicadas that come out in 1893, they belong to brood 18. And coming out in 1894, brood 19, and so on. And 18 through 30 are reserved for 13-year cicadas. So just when by saying brood 10 is emerging this year, that tells that's a 17-year cicada, and it's the 10th in the sequence since 1893, excuse me. And this did a lot to clear things up. It was just amazing how much this help matters. When you look at the distribution of the periodical cicadas, you see that the periodical cicadas are restricted to the eastern U.S., and they occur just over into Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, and then they extend into the east. They don't get up into Canada. They get up into southern Michigan and southern Wisconsin and up into upstate New York, a couple in Connecticut and Massachusetts, but and they don't get down into Florida at all. And so that's a wide range. Once we started mapping these things after 1893 by broods, then all of a sudden things started falling into place. It turns out there are 12 broods of 17-year cicadas and 3 broods of 13-year cicadas. And here are 9 of the 17-year cicadas. This is brood 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. That's interesting here. Ohio, let's focus on Ohio. Here's brood 5. That's in eastern Ohio. We have brood 8, which is just an extreme northeastern Ohio, but you'll notice that up here in the corner, there's a little bit of a gap, and we find that's where brood 8 tends to be focused. We have, continuing, those are the first 9. Here we have brood 10, 13. There is no brood 11 or 12. And here's the brood that's coming out this year. I'll show a bigger, larger map in a second. 13 and 14. You notice that 14 almost entirely overlaps with 10. And that's because over the last couple hundred years, 14 has been slowly accelerating and populations have been jumping ahead by 4 years and then start resetting the clock at 17 to give us such a large brood 10 population. These are the 3 broods of 13-year cicadas. This is brood 19, 22, and 23. Again, continuing for Ohio, we've got a brood 10 here in Western Ohio. We've got brood 14 in mostly Southern Ohio. And one of the discoveries that my lab made a few years ago, we have a 13-year brood here in Ohio. It's restricted to Claremont and Broward County, and there's about 10 counties in northern Kentucky. So those are the differences of the broods, and you can just see how that pattern sort of fell into place. There's no brood 11, no brood 12. So if after this year, there'll be no periodical cicadas anywhere in the United States until 2024. And here it is, your periodical cicada decoder ring. It starts in this first line here with 1634, because that's the first historical record of periodical cicadas with brood 14. And then the oldest brood 10 cicadas date at 1715. But these are all the numbers. So this year, 2021, we find right here, the cicadas will return in 2038 and again in 2055. So if you're planning ahead, you now have your dates in mind. And brood 10, it is a large geographic 17-year brood, occurs in 14 states in the District of Columbia, and almost the entire state of Indiana has it. There's some openings. I'll talk about that in a minute. Restricted mostly to the southwest, a little pocket up here in northwest Ohio, scattered in Kentucky and Tennessee and West North Carolina, and then over here in the east, the southern quarter of Pennsylvania is just packed with them. A few are in New York, at least historically they've been there, and we got them in New Jersey, Delaware, and of course Maryland as well, and a few scattered in Western Virginia and here in Northern Virginia. So that's where they're found. What should you be looking for? Well, in the last 2 weeks, a lot of people have been reporting on Cicada Safari, my app, about chimneys. And these chimneys are these little mud extensions that the cicada nymphs, the immature cicadas, while they're still in their tunnel underground, start to build up to increase the height of their tunnel. You might remember it was about a week or two ago on a Saturday, we had a day where it just almost rained, just an incessant drizzle for most of the day. With our clay soil, that water tends to get down into the tunnel and accumulate at the base of the tunnel. It doesn't drain away very quickly. And when that happens, the cicadas extend their tunnel to get above the water line. And these can be anywhere between 1 inch to 2 inches. The records I've seen in the literature are 12 inches in length. The most I've seen here this week, the last week in my searches, is between 4 and 5, or the largest that I've been finding out here in Southwest Ohio. So that's what we start looking for in mid to late April, and it's here, so we know they're coming. When will they arrive? Well, periodical cicadas appear and start to emerge when 2 things tend to happen. 1, the soil temperature reaches 64 degrees Fahrenheit, and we've had nice soaking rain. And here's a photograph in 2004 of a cicada nymph that just popped out of the ground. Just this hasn't even pulled its abdomen out of the soil yet. It just broke through the soil and is ready to emerge as a nymphal cicada, ready to start that transition. This happened on a day. This actually happened here in Delhi in 2004 on May the 16th. That's when they came out in big big numbers. But that's the call to arms, if you will. The soil temperature gets 64 degrees Fahrenheit and a nice soaking rain to soften things up. And that causes the cicadas to really start emerging. And they all don't come out in one night. It takes about 2 full weeks for all the cicadas to emerge. And that's because it depends on local, it also depends on local exposure. A south-facing side of a tree will get warmer before the north-facing side of that same tree, and it'll take a few days for that soil temperature to reach the same temperature all around that tree, which causes that delay. They emerge from holes in the ground. These are holes about the size of your pinky. And what I did here, this inset that you see, I poured plaster of Paris down some of these holes and to see what the tunnels look like. This one is about 6 inches in length. These are about 8 inches in length. And you can see they're sort of meandering little things. This is the surface area, but they sort of give you an idea what the cicada underground abode looks like. This particular photograph behind it was the densest I found in 2004. This was at 356 cicadas per square yard. That's a lot of bugs. Incredible lot of bugs. This is taken in a cemetery, and what I was able to do is I estimated how much area do we have under each of these oak trees, and it came out to probably about 7,000 cicadas were emerging under each of the trees over that 2-week period. And with all the oaks in that particular part of that cemetery, the estimate was that 230,000, just under 250,000 cicadas emerged in that one spot in that cemetery. And that's pretty big numbers, especially for an insect that's nearly 2 inches long, and the smaller species are at least 1.5 inches. And what they're doing, and they crawl out in great numbers, what they're doing as soon as they leave the ground is trying to find a place to transform themselves into an adult. Now, if you've been gardening and you've been digging up cicadas, you'll notice that right here behind the eyes, there's this little black patch that you see behind the eyes. They form that just before they come out as an adult. And if you find cicadas right now while you're gardening and you don't see that patch, that tells you they're not ready to emerge yet. But you've dug them up in the process of planting your spring flowers. They crawl up an upright surface. It can be a tree, it can be a wall, it can be a fence post, it could be a headstone, what you name it. I've seen them do this on tires. I've seen them do it on blades of grass. And what they're going to do is lock their tarsal claws into a surface, into a tree trunk. Get a good purchase on this vertical surface and start the process of transforming to an adult. That starts when a split occurs in their nymphal skin, their exoskeleton, if you will, their shell, their nymphal shell, splits all across the thorax, then extends forward to the head capsule. And once that opening occurs, then the adult cicada inside starts to wriggle its way out of the exoskeleton, slowly pulling itself out, eventually hanging nearly upside down, only held in place by just the narrowness of that opening that's holding its abdomen in place. These white filaments that you're seeing are the tracheal tubes that have to be pulled out of the adult because they're part of they're still part of the nymphal breathing apparatus. So they're pulled out of that adult as well in their development. They hang like this for about 20 minutes to get their tarsal claws, these little brown claws, let them harden a little bit so that when they bend forward and grab a hold of its exoskeleton, it's able to get a good grip and then wriggle its abdomen free. And there you have it, a cicada. But it's not ready yet. It's not quite an adult. The wings are all shriveled up. The abdomen is sort of a bloated appearing in nature. So what we have happening next is the cicada starts to pump fluid through the wings, and that expands the wings slowly. Eventually, the wings are going to be expanded to its fullest, and they'll be held tent-like over the back of the abdomen. You can see here really nicely, and I'll go back to this slide here. Here are those little black patches I told you to look for on the nymph if you should encounter a nymph in the soil. So here it is. It looks like a cicada in shape, but not in color. It hasn't gone through the process of hardening its exoskeleton or of adding tanning, which is the coloring of the exoskeleton. From that point when that cicada just popped out of the soil to this point, it's about an hour and a half. So when this starts to happen in a few days, go outside after sundown and watch this, and just get a lawn chair, just sit there and just watch this. It's like having David Attenborough in your backyard. It's just an amazing thing to watch. Depending on air temperature, over the next hour and a half, the cicada will mature into its adult appearance, red eyes, black body, orange wings, and orange legs. But it's still not quite ready to start making the next generation. What it will do now after this, it's been 3 hours since it's been out of the ground, is it will climb up to the top of a tree, and it takes another 5 days for it to complete the hardening of the exoskeleton and complete its full development to be an adult and mature cicada. The next morning, you walk out, you're going to find the yard, your trees, grass riddled with these ghostly reminders of what happened the night before. These are the shed skins, the shed exoskeletons of the last nymphal stage. And there's a lot of information in these skins. For example, if you've got someone that is maybe has a kid that's going to have a science fair project to do, you can go out and collect all the skins you can find, label it for the first day, second day, third day, and so on over a 10-day period. You'll find is that the first 5 days, more males emerge than females, and then the females become more predominant. It turns out it's a 50-50 male-female ratio, but more males will come out first, and they will essentially give their lives so that other cicadas can survive and produce the next generation. And so they keep coming. They keep coming. They keep coming. More and more and more of these cicadas just keep coming out of the ground. It's amazing. Some of the numbers I've seen in the past in Hyde Park, I've seen as high as 250 per square yard. In Price Hill, I've seen everywhere between 150 to 200 per square yard. Madeira, about 150 to 175 per square yard. A little bit fewer numbers, but maybe about 175 to 150 in Marymount, just to give you an idea. As you get further east into Batavia, that's going to be brood 14 territory. You may get a few, but nowhere near what you'll see in 4 years. So the whole purpose of cicadas is, of course, to reproduce. And that starts when the male starts singing for a mate. And here you see the singing apparatus. I'm holding it back, the wing back, and on the first abdominal segment is this timbal. It's white that it's chitin, but it's white with these ribs in it. You might be able to see some fine ribs there. That it's got muscles on the inside that when it pulls in, it causes those ribs to buckle, and that makes a popping sound. It's like taking a bendy straw and bending it back and forth 200 times a second, and that's how you get your call. The male abdomen is mostly hollowed, serves as a resonating chamber, and that's how the males sing. They gather in trees in large numbers, which we call chorusing centers, and they just blast it out. What they're singing from, ecologically speaking, we call this, excuse me, a lek, L-E-K. And the males are singing, and you might notice that the calls get really loud. Indeed, the loudest I've measured is 96 decibels, but they'll sort of, the loudness actually declines a little bit, maybe down to the low 80s, and they get loud again. And what's happening is if a male is in the tree and he's singing and he's not being recognized by a female after 2 or 3 tries, he and other cicadas will fly to a new branch or a new tree across the way. And that causes the loudness to subside a little bit. Then it kicks back up and they all start singing again. Now, the females don't sing. They do not have these timbals. Instead, the female responds at the appropriate part of the call by flicking her wings. And I'll show you a little video of how that works later in the program. And if the male hears that flick, he'll turn, face the female, he'll sing again, she'll flick, he'll walk closer, flick, he'll sing, she'll flick, and eventually he'll modify that call into a second mating call, which is very similar but without that gap for her to flick her wings. And then mating, sings a third call as he begins the mating process. And here are 2 cicadas that are mating. Females tend to mate only once. Males can mate seem to mate up to 3 times. Most of them mate once. 85% of the males mate only once. 10% twice, and 5% 3 times. After mating, the female lays her eggs by puncturing the terminal branch of a tree with a structure we call an ovipositor. This ovipositor, here you see an enlargement, extends outward. It's got sort of like ribs on it. It's actually got a central stabilizing rod, and then on each side, a serrated cutting blade or digging blade. It literally, as she pushes this up against the tree, it saws into the branch. And once inside of the branch, she here deposits eggs on each side of the central part of the ovipositor, the egg laying structure. Here's an egg here, here's this mate, here's an egg here, a mate, and so on. And she keeps doing this. She will keep doing this until she either A, runs out of twig, and then when she goes to a new twig, or B, she runs out of eggs. And this is what the egg nests look like. Usually in many cases, it's on the underside of a branch. And you can see right here where the little crosshairs are, that's when she inserts her ovipositor, sticks it in, and then as she slowly pulls it out, she's depositing an egg on each side of where she's punctured the ovipositor, punctured the twig, pulls the ovipositor out, walks 1/4 of an inch, and does it again. Lays more eggs, walks about 1/4 inch, punctures it again. And so that's how the egg laying takes place. She will continue going, as I said, until she runs out of her eggs, and she has just over 500 eggs to lay. And when you think about it, half of all the cicadas you see are female, and each of those females are going to lay 500 eggs. Now you're going to think about how many millions of cicadas are going to be potentially produced in the next 17 years. Now that egg laying can can tear up the vascular tissue in the trees. And here you see a cemetery with a lot of these leaves that look like they've been wilted and dried out and brown. We call this flagging. In some cases, the branch will even break at that point, and the branch will sort of dangle there, move back and forth in the wind with these brown, dried out looking leaves. This particular process can damage very young trees. And if you have a small tree that you think needs protection, you can do things like get window screening and make a very large loose bag to put over the tree. All I have to do is create a barrier so the female can't fly to that tree and lay her eggs. But if your tree's 5 feet and more and has a lot of branches, it's not likely that the cicadas will kill your tree. We don't recommend spraying because of the fact that it's not a residual that will actually, the cicadas will pick up a lot, not like what you see if you sprayed for cockroaches and things like that. Now, the next question that we have is, and I'll end up here with this: what good are they? I get asked a lot. And this is one of the examples of how cicadas are beneficial. If we look at cicadas in their life history, what they do is they carry out their generation time. When the cicadas come out of the ground, these holes that they produce is like a natural aeration. It's good for the soil. It allows later in the summer, after a hot summer with a little rain, for water when it does rain to go down the holes and help to water the trees, excuse me. When the cicadas come out in big numbers, that provides a food pulse for all sorts of animals: dogs, cats, raccoons, rodents. I've seen squirrels eat these things. Birds love them. Swans love them. I've seen geese eat these things. Indeed, the Division of Wildlife in Ohio has reported that the male body weight in areas where there's been a cicada emergence tends to be a little larger than years when there isn't an emergence. So this is a food pulse that helps the recovery of some small animal populations. With the rodent populations that increase with cicadas, that provides more food for owls and for other raptors, small hawks, and so on. So that's a benefit as well. Lastly, after the cicadas lay their eggs, this egg laying is like a natural pruning. And while it looks terrible right now on this tree, the number of acorns produced in these oaks the following tree should increase. Indeed, it provides an opportunity for plants to produce more flowers and more fruits and more seeds, and that's good for the ecosystem once every 20 years. In fact, we're seeing in areas where the emerald ash borer has just decimated lots of ash trees, that maples are increasing, because this year we're going to see the cicada damage on maples. Next year they'll produce more little winged maple fruits than normal, and that will help fill in those gaps over time. Lastly, when the cicadas have been on mating, they die, and they stink to high heaven as they decay. But they're decaying; those nutrients from the decaying and dead cicadas actually get into the soil below the trees and form a wonderful nutrient cache for those trees. So that's what they do. They're wonderfully adapted to a life in the eastern deciduous forest. If they all were wiped out tomorrow, we'd still have our forest. But when they do come out, they provide a pulse of food for animals. The following year, a probable pulse of fruit and seed production for plants. They provide nutrients for the tree and benefit the soil. And even some of the estimates now about the soil turned over by the emerging cicadas is indeed quite large indeed. Now, the question, do you have cicadas in your yards? And you can find out. Here's an example of one of the egg nests that healed after 1 year. And indeed, some of these egg nests don't cause a breakage of the branch. They heal over. And if you know your tree morphology, you can count back. You can count back 17 years when looking for the annual growth scar on the branch and find a healed cicada egg nest. And here you see this structure here healed over in this particular maple. And it's and if you see that in your tree, straight down is where the cicadas are going to be coming out of. They'll be within a yard of where those cicadas drop. So that's a way to tell whether you're going to have cicadas this year or not. Another thing to tell is to just wait a few months and you're going to see them. So that's what to expect and what to look for. I want to take a couple minutes to talk to you about brood 10. This is the brood that we have this year. And not only is it's important, not only because it's the largest brood the largest brood of 17-year cicadas. It's also important because it occurs in the eastern U.S. Among some of the biggest urban areas. So when brood 10 was first reported was in 1715 by Reverend Andreas Sandel. This is the very church that he was preaching at. It was the Gloria Dei Swedish Lutheran Church. That church still stands. And so I'm hoping that someone in Philadelphia will see if cicadas are still there, because to me, this is the brood 10 mothership. This is where the first record of cicadas. And what Reverend Sandel wrote on May the 9th, 1715 was as follows. This month, some singular flies came out of the ground. The English call them locusts. They left the ground. When they left the ground, holes could be seen everywhere in the roads, and especially in the woods. They were then encased in shells, out of which they crawled. It seemed most wonderful how, being covered with the shell, they were able to burrow their way in the hard ground. When they began to fly, they made a peculiar noise, and being found in great multitudes all over the country, their noise made the cowbells inaudible in the woods. They were also destructive, making slits in the bark of the trees where they deposited their worms, which withered the branches. Swines and poultry ate them, but what was more astonishing, when they first appeared, some people split them open and ate them, holding them to be the same kind as those said to have been eaten by John the Baptist. And so that's our first historical record of brood 10, from this, written by the preacher at this church in Philadelphia. We've had 18 emergences of periodical cicadas, and these emergences occurred next in 1732, and that's when the 1732 emergence was seen by a friend of Benjamin Franklin's, who told Ben Franklin about, who recorded all that and gave that on to a student of Linnaeus's, Père Kalm, who visited Philadelphia in 1749. Kalm was the person who collected cicada specimens and took back to Sweden to give to Linnaeus, and Linnaeus described our first cicada species. At that time it was called Cicada septendecim. That's the first of our major emergences. We also see that in 1749, the cicadas were also observed by Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker is an individual that's sort of been lost in history, but he was an extremely intelligent individual. He was a Black American. His mother was a freed slave, but his father was from the Caribbean and was never a slave. And so he saw the 1749 emergence, and he wrote in his diary that he just wanted to step on everyone he could find because he thought they were going to destroy the earth, because he thought they were locusts. And when the term locust is the term that was used in the Bible for grasshoppers that go in and eat up all the crops and what have you. And so that's what he was concerned about. He witnessed the same emergence again in 1766, 1783, and just before the emergence in 1800, he wrote down his notes about periodical cicadas. He taught himself mathematics. He was involved with the surveying of the laying out of the boundaries of Washington, D.C. And he actually became so proficient at mathematics that he published several almanacs and was calculating when eclipses would occur. But I'm interested, of course, in what he thought about periodical cicadas. He noted correctly that these indeed were prime numbered life cycles. 17 is a prime number, meaning the number 17 can only be divided by 1, equal without any remainder. And unfortunately, because he didn't publish this at the time, his contribution to verifying that life cycle wasn't noted. But what he did write at the very end of his notes was the following: the hindermost parts have rot off, and it does not appear to be any pain to them, for they continue singing until they die. And what he was observing was the manifestation of a fungal disease that afflicts periodical cicadas. And here I'm holding a fungal disease where the abdomen is so distended with the fungus that indeed the hind end popped up off, and you can see inside the fungus growing in the interior of the animal. And here's 2 others where the abdomen has completely fallen off as well. He recorded that in 1800, and that was 51 years before it was formally identified and described by another cicada researcher. His notes were published in 1834, but didn't make I believe might be 1834 or 45 by the Maryland Historical Society, but they didn't get wide enough dissemination to help with that early work on the fungal disease. But he studied these things nonetheless. The next series of emergences that are of importance are 1834 and 1851. And this brings in the work of Nathaniel Potter and Gideon B. Smith. Potter is a medical doctor living in Baltimore, and he started studying wanted to start studying cicadas in 1783, but he had such a heavy patient load, he never got around to doing it. He thought, I'll do this in the year 1800. Same thing happened, and again in 1817. So in 1834, he decided, I am going to do this year. But he realized that his procrastination and his stick-to-itiveness, he needed help. And so he had met a man by the name of Gideon B. Smith, who was the assistant to the editor of the American Farmer, and he had published a small paper in the American Farmer in 1829. And Smith started working with Potter for the 1834 Brood 10 emergence. What happened at that time, which is interesting, is they documented all sorts of things about the biology. So, for example, here in 1839, they published the first standalone book on periodical cicadas with hand-colored, watercolored pictures of the male and the female decim. Here's a female egg laying. They even showed a diagram of the outline of the egg and the outline of the new hatchling of the periodical cicadas. When the eggs are laid, as I mentioned, in the terminal ends of branches, and it takes about 6 to 10 weeks before they hatch. So towards the middle of late July and into early August, that's when all these cicada eggs are going to hatch. And as soon as these eggs hatch, the nymphs immediately fall to the ground because they're extremely vulnerable to spiders and beetles and ants. And they drop to a blade of grass and run down the grass blade and into the soil as fast as possible. They'll feed on grass roots for the next few weeks. And then by New Year's Day, they'll be 8 to 12 inches below the surface, sucking on a tree root. That's where they'll be for the next 17 years. And so this is the first color illustration of periodical cicadas published in 1839. Well, it turned out Smith, Potter dies in the early 1840s, and Gideon Smith takes over. And Gideon Smith starts in the 1840s to crowdsource periodical cicada records. And that involved sending letters to newspapers, to either the national newspapers that were sent all over the country. And he'd say, dear sir, I wish to ask your readers if that I expect to see cicadas in your locality this year. And I'd appreciate it if people would write to me if they see the cicadas. Of course, he called them locusts at the time. And by the time Smith died in 1867, he had documented not the full distribution, but had documented all the broods we recognize today. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find a portrait of Smith. I've not been able to find a lost manuscript of his, although I've been able to find probably excerpts of probably 3/4 of it. But what I did find was a letter he wrote back in the late 1830s. And so at least we have his autograph. Following Smith's passing in 1867, in 1868, this gentleman took over as the major cicada researcher. This is Charles Valentine Riley, a gifted artist, because he painted that illustration of the transition of the cicada nymph to the adult that you see on the left there. And Riley was eventually became the first entomologist of the state of Missouri, and eventually the second national entomologist for the USDA. And he helped coordinate some of the early mapping that occurred in 1868 and 1885. And under his direction going into the 1890s, they were planning a major mapping effort of brood 10 in 1902. But unfortunately, he was killed in an unfortunate bicycling accident before that occurred. His work was picked up by Marlett, who was the guy that created the numbering system that we're using today. And this was the map published in advance of the 1902 emergence. And what the USDA did that year is they sent out 15,000 postcards to superintendents of schools, to postmasters, to conductors of railway stations, for example, asking that they saw the locusts to please let them know. And they received just under 1,000 responses, and that's what became the foundation of the next map I'll show you, the map from 1902 that coordinated that essentially gave us the fundamentals of where brood 10 is located. I put Teddy Roosevelt here because Teddy Roosevelt it's an interesting individual. He was his wife and mother died within 24 hours of each other, and he was so despondent that he went out and bought interest in a cattle ranch in western North Dakota. Now, full disclosure, I'm from North Dakota. And so Teddy Roosevelt is a very popular figure. And I grew up really admiring him because he was from North Dakota. And here was this barrel-chested man. He boxed at Harvard when he was a student. And while out there, he learned, he was a very good horseman. He was able to ride with the best of the ranchers that were out there. And he learned to project his voice over a herd of cattle. And that's important because the picture that you see in the lower right here, that's the address, him giving an address at Arlington National Cemetery in 1902 during the brood 10 emergence. The cicadas were singing. And this man who learned to project his voice not only over a herd of cattle, but when he gave presentations in Cincinnati to 10,000 people, people said they could hear every word as if they didn't have amplification. They could hear him very, very nicely and perfectly. But in 1902, the cicadas almost drowned him out. So that's our interest in what's going on with Teddy Roosevelt. Now, in 1919, the big concern was brood 10 going extinct. And that's because the USDA was concerned with all the clear cutting of trees for agriculture that were wiping out the prime habitat for brood 10. And so in 1919, there was a concerted effort to get some more mapping information. They didn't do as well as 1902, but there was concern that indeed what we would see with the emergence of brood 10, that the numbers could be in decline. And as crazy as that sounds, brood 11 went extinct in 1954, and that was a major brood in 1699, 1716, and 1733. So it is possible for broods to disappear. In 1936, we had the USDA making its first video, a black and white video directed by this man you see up in the corner. That's James Hislop, and he became the major cicada worker for the late 30s and into the 40s. With World War II breaking out, the USDA stopped their mapping effort because they thought they had them all. So that's 1936. Let's jump ahead to 1970, and this is an interesting example. We see that the cicadas went to college. Now, we know in 1936, the cicadas emerged at Indiana University, and it was during their commencement address, and no one could hear the speaker. No one seemed to complain much, but they stopped holding their commencements outside after 1936. In 1970, Bob Dylan received an honorary degree from Princeton University in New Jersey. He was seated next to Coretta Scott King, who also received an honorary degree that year. And in the background, he could hear the cicadas screaming. in the area of Princeton University. And so he get back to California after the ceremony, and he wrote a song titled The Day of the Locust. And here's an excerpt. So something to check into Spotify to find the full version of The Day of the Locust written by Bob Dylan. So not only these insects attract scientists' attention, they attracted artists, musicians, and others. So that's the 1970 emergence. I'm now living in Cincinnati now in 1987. And I start my first time mapping out brood 10. And I did that for 1987 and 2004. And this is what we're expecting, what we're seeing now. Indeed, brood 10 is in decline. What the USDA projected back in 1919. The large dots in these maps are counties that have widespread cicada emergences. The smaller dots are areas where the cicadas emerge as small patches here and there, and they're separated by areas where there are no cicadas. The open circles are areas where the cicadas are now extinct in those counties. They have not been reported there for at least two emergences. And you can see here that in the northern half of Indiana, the cicadas have declined quite a bit. In 1885, they were present through the entire state. Here in Ohio, we still have good numbers here in Southwest Ohio, but the northern half of the state, we see the brood 10 cicadas in decline. And so that's a thing of concern for us. When we go ahead to 2004, the emergencies before now, this was an important emergence for my work, because we had Mount St. Joseph University, Sir David Attenborough show up, and he recorded his show Life in the Undergrowth in Cincinnati. And here's a brief excerpt of what he showed.
After 17 years of living underground, the cicadas are now approaching the climax of their lives. And for the males, that means this. The call is his way of attracting a female. The females reply with a quite different sound. A click made by flicking her wings. So that's what the males are listening out for. I can imitate the female's wing flip with a snap of my fingers, and that causes them to follow me anywhere because they're so determined to find a female. Bring you back. I'm not coming this way.
Yes, Sir David did have to terrorize that poor cicada at Mount St. Joe, but it's an example of how the mating behavior is utilized by the males to attract, and the wing flick of the female. So here we are, 2021, and we have brood 10 coming to Cincinnati, and that's where I'm asking you to help. We have developed, to help map out this cicada and its distribution, a free app called Cicada Safari. It is available free at the iPhone App Store or on Google Play. I ask your help because since 1987, thousands of people in my fellow citizens of Cincinnati have helped us map out previous broods in Greater Cincinnati by sending us information. This app does not trace what you buy on Amazon. What we want to know is where you've seen cicadas. And so you download the app, and then you open up the app and go on your own Cicada Safari. And when you see a cicada, take its photograph. You do that by just touching this little icon here at the bottom that opens up your camera. After you've taken that photograph, you click on a little paper airplane, and that sends us the photograph. And every photograph we receive is identified, verified that's a real periodical cicada, and then goes on our live map. And it's rather important for us to get a good, solid map of what's happening. There's only like about a half a dozen to a dozen of us that work on periodical cicadas. So we need your help. And I'm tickled to tell you that as of today, we had our 50,000th download of Cicada Safari. So we are on the brink of having the most comprehensive map possible, with 50,000 people helping us map them out. So I ask you to do that to help me map out the brood. If you would like to get more information about what's going on with Brood 10, my new book, Periodical Cicadas, the Brood 10 edition, just got published by the Ohio Biological Survey, and you can get copies on Amazon if you like. And they'll give you more backgrounds of things that happened during the emergences and more in their biology. But I'd like you to join us. Join Mount St. Joe and our Center for IT Engagement, the University of Connecticut, the Ohio Biological Survey, cicadamania.com, the Indiana Academy of Science, the University of Maryland have all embraced Cicada Safari. I don't have their icons on here, but we've got help now coming from the University of Tennessee and Kentucky and and people in North Carolina. So join us. Help us get the best map ever of Brood 10 of the periodical cicadas. Thank you. And I'm of Jennifer and Lisa. I'm available for questions.
All right, thanks. I'm going to start with some of the questions at the beginning. We've had a couple questions about, do cicadas harm young fruit trees? And if somebody is trying to protect their trees with netting or another material, should they close them up at the ground? Like, do the females fly up to the branches, or do they crawl up to the branches?
Great question. First of all, you don't want to wrap as I mentioned, once the cicadas emerge from the ground, they're going to be it's going to be 5 days before they start mating and flying around. So you got some time there. You don't want to bag up your trees too early, and you only need to bag up the branches at the top. They fly in to the branches. They also will crawl up if they should land near the base, but you don't need to have this whole tree all the way down to the ground covered with the netting. If you do this, it's probably best to make sure that you have a big population. If you only have a few cicadas in your area, you can sort of watch it carefully and respond if necessary. But most trees that are at risk are going to be between 5 feet and shorter in length, 3 to 4 feet, 1 or 2 branches. That's going to be the most vulnerable.
Then we have another question. What do cicadas eat? And are there any plants that are toxic to them?
Cicadas eat by sucking on tree roots. They're feeding on the xylem tissue, and that's the water conducting tissue of the roots that bring water and minerals up to the leaves. They don't eat flowers. They don't eat trees necessarily. They will hydrate, and they do that by puncturing the tree bark with a very, very extremely fine the mouth parts and get a little bit of fluid. The best analogy that's come recently is if you've gotten your COVID vaccine, I think like me, you were probably shocked at how non-painful that was. It just sort of slid in and out of it. Oh, that's not the shots I got as a kid. And so that's what you see going on with cicadas. The mouth parts are very fine. They stay hydrated, but they don't eat plants like locusts do. Locusts are grasshoppers with chewing mouth parts that can chew up leaves and what have you.
All right, thanks. We've got a teacher who's asking that her students want to know, why do cicadas wait underground for so long, and why don't they lay their eggs underground in the first place?
The survival that we basically on what we've seen so far, we believe that the periodical cicadas evolved during the Pliocene. That's when the common ancestor occurred for those groups, and that was just at the beginning of the ice ages. And so the long life expectancy, the long life cycle, is thought to have evolved in response to the ice age. And we had 4 ice advances where it moved down and then retreated and so on. The last ice sheet, for example, occurred about 20,000 years ago. The ice sheet was just north of Tri-County Mall. There were no cicadas here at that time. And so the cicadas that were in the refugia just south of here, that having that long life cycle was probably quite adaptive, because at the extent of where the cicadas were, if they're always down below that, they could last for long blocks of time, 13 years in that case, because we thought 13 years seems to be ancestral to the 17, before the glacier and the ice ages started to retreat. So that seems to be a response to the ice age. We know that The 13-year cicadas have a southern distribution. The 17-year have a more northern distribution. Why don't they lay their eggs in trees? Well, all cicadas do follow this way. Why don't they lay their eggs underground? Excuse me. The cicadas as a group all share this in common. They lay their eggs in plant matter, in the plant branches, and then they drop to the ground. So it's not something they would be able to change easily, because that's what their ancestors have been doing.
How many eggs do 17-year female periodical cicadas produce versus annual cicadas?
They both I've never done an account of the annual cicadas, so I can't tell you for sure what that would be. There's 500 eggs per female with the periodical cicadas, and it wouldn't be surprising if we had 500 eggs with those, because so few individuals are out. It looks like the mortality of cicadas is like maybe 98%. So even having 500 eggs, not all of them are going to survive. The mortality underground is intense. So the annual cicadas, even if they had 500 eggs per female, which is probable, there's so few in the adult population that they won't lay proportionally enough to cause the big numbers we see with periodicals.
Are cicadas good on pizza? Are they good on any other foods?
You'd be surprised how many people in the last 2 weeks have wanted to talk to me about eating cicadas. I have eaten cicadas. I like them too much now to eat them anymore. They've been very good to my career, and so I'm not as enthusiastic about it. They taste to me like cold canned asparagus. They're green flavor because they're feeding on plant juices. Obviously, there's a very green flavor. Are they good on things? So, we had there are a lot of chefs I've been in contact with that have wanted to know where to go find them. The problem for these chefs is that it's not a sustainable food source. If you get cicadas now and you get a hankering for them, you've got to wait 17 years to get them again without travel. And if you could travel, you have to wait at least 3 years, because there's no brood 11 and no brood 12. So it'll be 3 years before they'll emerge again in Chicago. So, and then people may not want you from Cincinnati coming up and eating their cicadas.
We've got time for another question or two. Are cicadas considered a vulnerable species?
Yes. It's clear when you look at northern Indiana, and if you've driven across India, let's say go to Chicago, sometimes you've probably noticed that the northern half of the state is mostly farmland, and in the little pockets of trees that have occurring there has subdivided the cicadas into smaller and smaller patches, to the point that patch will not produce enough cicadas to overwhelm the population, and they're gone. So they're not going to disappear immediately. Brood 10 is going to be around for many, many more generations, but they are disappearing in part of their range. The most vulnerable population today is brood 7. That's down to just a couple of counties in northern New York. Fortunately, it's on protected land, so it probably has a chance to hold on for a few more emergences, if not longer. Brood 14 is slowly emerging into 10 and disappearing, so that brood's going to eventually die out, probably in the next 150 years.
All right, and I've got one last question here. It looks like somebody who uses cicadas for fish bait, or is interested in using them for fish bait. Is there a way to preserve the cicadas for such purpose?
In 2008, when brood 14 emerged, I was doing some work with the BBC over in Merrimont, and there was a grandfather and his grandson collecting cicada nymphs, the immatures, and they had 10 5-gallon buckets, these large deep pockets you get like at Home Depot, and they filled all of them up in one or two evenings, and there were still more cicadas coming. So what they were doing, they're terrible. Early in the year, this year, they'll be great fish bait. Later in the year, the fish won't strike out. They're going to be so used to them. But what they were going to do is freeze them, and they use them fish bait over the next 16 years.
Great. Well, thank you. I think. So one more question.
Certainly.
What happens after the eggs are laid? After the female lays her eggs in the tree branch, what happens?
Okay, what happens once the eggs have been laid, the embryo insect continues development. As I said, that takes 6 to 6 to 10 weeks for them to all to come out. And that's because maybe the first one's laid, they'll be, could be early in the emergence and the ones later. But those eggs actually go through what's called organogenesis. They and programmed cell death is how the embryo insects develop, where it's really kind of neat. You've got this mass of tissue, and then they start this. It's like your fingers. During our fetal development and our embryonic development, we got the little paddle of our forelegs, but then programmed cell death kills the skin in between, so we get fingers. And the same thing happens with insects. They get their legs that way and their mouth parts, and that's what's going on inside the cicada egg. And then when they do hatch, they literally crawl out of the egg shell, and it's a very thin, transparent like structure. You can dissect these out. If you wait till September and all the eggs have hatched, you can get some egg nests, and using fine needles, dig into the tree, and you can find that some of the eggs were hatched that look almost transparent. The ones that are solid, for whatever reason, that embryo didn't develop. And that's how we figure out what the mortality is of the eggs. Right now, I can tell you that for most of the 13-year cicadas I've studied, the mortality is only 6 to 7%. For brood 10, the last time, the average of all the sites I visited was 15% mortality. So 85% of those eggs hatched. If the cicadas should lay their egg, let's say on a white pine, a conifer, the sap, the terpenes that you find in conifers actually killed 50% of those eggs. We also know that if the branch after flagging takes place and that branch should break and it dangles, that probably will kill up to 50% of the eggs. And what happens is that they need to stay moist for them to develop. A man by the name of Moses Bartram in 1766 collected all these egg nests. Some he just laid on a piece of paper, some he put in moist dirt, some he put in vials with water, and some he just picked up off the ground. And the ones that were laying outside without any water at all, those all died. The ones in the water and the ones in the moist dirt, all those eggs hatched. He was able to collect those and study those in detail.
Great. Well, thank you. I think we are at our time. So Dr. K, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Fascinating. And to all of our participants, thank you. This is going to be recorded and posted on the library's YouTube channel if you want to refer back to it, and refer family and friends to it as well. And the library does have many more resources, including some of Dr. K's books. So if you have more questions, please check out our library resources.
And if I can, before we end, if you have more questions, you're also willing, please go to cicadasafari.org, which is our website that supports the app. And you'll find things like instructions on how to fold an origami cicada, a cicada your kids can color, and other activities that make this a more enjoyable experience. And this is a gateway to natural history and to science. And who knows, you may have a medical doctor or a scientist in your house. Expose them to some cicadas and see what happens.
Everybody have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you.